Vanessa Harris kept her hands firmly on the steering wheel, her pulse steady, her breath even. Years of high-pressure cases, long days in courtrooms, and navigating complex political negotiations had conditioned her to remain calm under pressure. But this wasn't a courtroom. This wasn't a debate with a powerful senator or a high-stakes trial. No, this was a dark, empty stretch of road, with only the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror to remind her something wasn't quite right. She had been in this situation before, but it felt different. The patrol car behind her wasn't just any routine stop. She could tell by the way the officer's headlights cut through the night that this wasn't going to be ordinary. The moment the lights flickered, her mind went into high gear. It didn't matter that she was a well-known civil rights attorney working closely with the governor's office. It didn't matter that she was driving a luxury sedan with a briefcase full of legal documents. In this moment, none of it would matter. As Officer Brian Ellis approached, his flashlight beaming straight into her face, Vanessa's hand didn't move from the wheel. His body was stiff, his expression unreadable under the shadow of his cap. His voice came out clipped. "License and registration, ma'am." Vanessa took a slow, deliberate breath, aware of every movement she made. This was a test, and she wasn't about to give him any excuse to escalate things. "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" she inquired, her voice calm but firm. Ellis didn't answer her question. His lips tightened into a thin line. Without acknowledging her, he repeated, "License and registration." She remained composed, hands steady as she reached for the glove compartment, moving carefully to avoid giving him any reason to act impulsively. She handed over the documents without a word. Ellis took the papers from her and walked back to his patrol car, disappearing behind it. Vanessa's fingers lightly tapped against the wheel. She had anticipated moments like this, read about them, studied them in reports. But it was different when you were the one caught in the situation. When Ellis returned, his posture had shifted. He was no longer just a cop doing his job. There was something else in his stance. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Vanessa didn't react immediately, her mind calculating the best course of action. "Is there a reason for this request, officer?" she asked, her voice still steady. His jaw clenched. Without another word, he repeated, "Step out of the car." Vanessa unbuckled her seatbelt slowly, deliberately, and stepped out onto the asphalt. The night air was cool against her skin, and the click of her heels on the road seemed to echo in the silence. She knew the drill. Get out, comply, avoid any sudden movements. "Turn around," Ellis commanded. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly, but she complied, placing her hands behind her back. "Suspicious behavior," he muttered as he reached for his handcuffs. Suspicious behavior. The words hung in the air, a vague justification for whatever decision he chose to make. Vanessa's mind raced, but her body remained still, waiting. She could feel the tension in his movements, the way he anticipated her resistance. But Vanessa didn't react the way he expected. She complied, but with a quiet defiance. When he asked her if she had any weapons or outstanding warrants, she answered with a calm, "No." Just as Ellis was about to cuff her fully, the flash of another set of lights interrupted. A second patrol car arrived, and Sergeant Daniel Clark stepped out. His eyes scanned the situation, and when they landed on Vanessa, recognition flashed in them. "Ellis!" Clark barked. "What's going on here?" Sergeant Daniel Clark's voice cut through the tension, making Officer Ellis straighten up in an attempt to maintain control. But Vanessa could see the shift, the subtle change in the air as soon as Clark recognized her. She didn't need to see the expression on his face. She could feel the change in the way Ellis stood, how his posture faltered under the weight of his mistake. "Ellis!" Clark called out again, sharper this time. "What the hell is going on here?" Ellis, still holding Vanessa's wrists, tried to stay calm. "Routine stop. Suspicious behavior," he replied, his voice lacking the usual authority he'd had just moments before. But Clark wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on Vanessa's face, a flicker of recognition passing over him. She saw it, and the realization hit him like a punch. Clark didn't know her from a police database or a mugshot. No, he knew her from the courtroom, from the news, and from her work as a civil rights attorney. Vanessa saw the moment he understood. His face shifted slightly as if everything had just clicked into place. This wasn't just any woman. This was Vanessa Harris, a high-profile attorney working with the governor's office. Suddenly, the situation had escalated, but not in the way Ellis had expected. Now the power dynamics were shifting, and Vanessa could feel it. Clark's tone turned serious, his voice low but firm. "You just put handcuffs on Vanessa Harris?" He didn't wait for Ellis's response. "She's the governor's attorney." Vanessa didn't need to say a word. She could see the panic in Ellis's eyes as Clark's statement hung in the air. For the first time that night, Ellis faltered, his grip loosening slightly on the handcuffs. His earlier sense of control was slipping away, replaced by uncertainty. Vanessa didn't move. She stood there, composed and silent, watching the change unfold in front of her. It was clear to her now. Ellis hadn't recognized who she was when he first pulled her over. He had simply seen a black woman driving alone at night and made a decision based on a gut feeling, a feeling shaped by biases he likely didn't even know he had. But now, with Clark's arrival, everything had changed. The power wasn't in Ellis's hands anymore. "Ellis," Clark said again, his tone now icy, "you should have known better. You can't just treat people like this without cause. Do you even know who you're dealing with?" Ellis's face flushed, a mixture of anger and humiliation washing over him. He had been in control just moments ago, but now he was caught in his own mistake, exposed for the way he had treated Vanessa. He didn't have a comeback, didn't know how to explain away what he had done. His pride fought against the sinking realization that he had made a grave error. Vanessa finally spoke, her voice calm, almost too calm. "I'd like to speak to your captain," she said, the words deliberate, measured. Ellis's hand tightened on the handcuffs, as if he might push back. But the moment the words left Vanessa's mouth, the situation was already out of his hands. He turned to Clark, who was now watching him with a look that spoke volumes. There was no way Ellis could ignore her request. Clark, without hesitation, nodded. "Of course, Miss Harris," he said, his tone respectful now. Ellis's jaw clenched as he stood there, still holding the cuffs, unsure of how to proceed. He had lost control, and the weight of his mistake began to settle on him. Vanessa could feel the shift in the air. The power had shifted. She had remained calm, composed, and now she was the one holding the upper hand. As Clark stepped closer to her, Vanessa held his gaze for a moment longer. The realization that Ellis's authority had crumbled made her feel a small measure of satisfaction, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The silence between Vanessa and Officer Ellis stretched on, heavy with the realization of what had just happened. His hand still gripped the cold metal of the handcuffs, but his earlier confidence had evaporated. His pride was bruised, and it was clear that he wasn't sure how to proceed now that the power had shifted in the blink of an eye. Sergeant Clark stood beside Vanessa, his eyes still fixed on Ellis, but Vanessa was the one in control now. She didn't need to raise her voice or make a scene. Her presence alone had turned the tables. She turned her gaze back to Ellis, her tone measured but firm. "You were going to take me in without cause," she said, her words almost cutting through the air. "For what exactly? For asking a simple question? For driving while black?" Ellis hesitated. The words were there, on the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't form them. He had no justification for what he had done. In his mind, his actions had been justified, until now. Now, standing before a woman he didn't expect, someone whose influence he hadn't realized until it was too late, he found himself questioning everything. Clark's voice broke through the tension. "What exactly was suspicious about her, Ellis? That she asked why she was pulled over? That she was driving her own car?" His tone was cold now, dangerous in a way Vanessa hadn't expected. It wasn't just the reprimand of a fellow officer. It was the quiet fury of someone who recognized the underlying issue here. Vanessa's eyes didn't leave Ellis's face. "Tell me, officer," she continued, her voice calm but cutting, "if I hadn't been the governor's attorney, would you have treated me the same way?" Ellis's face flushed a deeper shade of red, but he didn't respond. His jaw clenched and his eyes darted to Clark, who was now standing with arms crossed, clearly unimpressed. Vanessa pressed on, not allowing him to deflect. "Would I still be in handcuffs right now if I wasn't who I am? Or would I be sitting in the back of your car, waiting to be processed for some trumped-up charge?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time Ellis looked away. His gaze dropped to the pavement, unable to meet Vanessa's eyes. It wasn't a confession, but it didn't need to be. The truth was plain to see. His initial suspicion had nothing to do with her behavior, and everything to do with the color of her skin and the assumptions he had made. Clark stepped forward now, his voice harsh as he spoke to Ellis. "You don't get to make decisions like that, not on your own, and certainly not without cause. You let your biases take over." Vanessa could see the shift in Clark now. His stance had softened, but there was an edge to his words. He wasn't siding with Ellis anymore. He was holding him accountable. "Do you know how many people you've stopped tonight, Ellis?" Vanessa asked, her tone almost mocking now. "Do you know how many of them were black? How many were made to feel like they were suspicious simply because of who they are?" Ellis shifted uneasily, but he didn't answer. His silence was all the answer she needed. "Let me ask you this," Vanessa continued, her voice still steady. "Would you have treated me like this if I were white? Would I have been pulled out of my car, questioned without reason, and handcuffed simply for asking why I was stopped?" Her words landed with precision, and this time, Ellis didn't have the answer. There was nothing left for him to say. Clark turned his gaze to Ellis once more, his disappointment palpable. "Take the cuffs off, Ellis," he ordered. The command wasn't a suggestion, and it left no room for argument. Ellis hesitated, but after a long, painful moment, he reached for the cuffs. The sound of the metal unlocking seemed louder than it was, a symbol of his defeat. As the handcuffs clicked open and fell to the ground, Vanessa rubbed her wrists, though she didn't show any sign of discomfort. She had already won. "You should have thought about this before you made the decision to treat her like a criminal," Clark added, his voice low but pointed. Vanessa gave Clark a brief nod of appreciation, but turned her attention back to Ellis. "Next time," she said quietly, "think before you act. And remember, not everyone you stop is someone you can control." Vanessa walked back to her car, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The flashing lights of the patrol cars seemed to fade into the distance, but the weight of the moment stayed with her. She didn't look back at Ellis or Clark. The scene was over, but it wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Inside the car, Vanessa exhaled deeply, trying to shake off the tension in her body. She hadn't been physically harmed, but the emotional toll of what had just happened was significant. She had been calm, controlled, and had come out unscathed. But how many others hadn't? How many people without the same background or influence had found themselves in similar situations, only to see things spiral out of control? Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, and she glanced at the screen. A message from Governor James Mitchell, his name flashing on the display. Without hesitation, she answered the call. "Vanessa," the governor's voice came through, steady but strained. "I just got off the phone with Sergeant Clark. Are you okay?" Vanessa didn't hesitate. "I'm fine," she said, though the exhaustion in her voice was unmistakable. "But we've got a much bigger problem than I thought." There was a pause on the other end, the governor likely processing her words. "What do you mean?" Vanessa's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she spoke. "It's not just Officer Ellis. This is systemic. Racial bias runs deep in the department. I've seen the reports. There's a pattern. Excessive stops of Black and Latino drivers, vague justifications for searches and detainments. It's not just one bad cop, James. It's a culture." The governor was silent for a moment, letting her words settle. "We need to fix this, Vanessa. It's long overdue." Vanessa looked out the windshield, her mind racing. "Yes, but the issue isn't just about one officer. It's about the system that lets these things happen. Officer Ellis didn't just decide to pull me over on a whim. His actions were the result of a mindset, a pattern of behavior that has been allowed to go unchecked for years." "I know," the governor replied, his voice heavy with concern. "What do we do about it?" Vanessa was already thinking ahead. "We start with accountability. We need to get an independent review board in place to examine past cases, to look at patterns of racial profiling and misconduct. We need full transparency. And as for Ellis, he should be suspended while the investigation takes place." "Agreed," the governor said. "I'll have my office begin drafting a statement. We'll need a full press release. And we need to push for mandatory anti-bias training for every officer in the department, from top to bottom." Vanessa nodded, though the action felt hollow. It's a start, James. But we both know that this won't change overnight. There are too many people with too much power to protect the status quo. The governor sighed. I know, but we have to try. Vanessa paused before speaking again, her voice quiet but firm. I'm going to do what I can to make sure we don't let this go. But the system needs to change. If not now, when? The call ended, but the weight of the conversation lingered. As she parked the car and stepped out, Vanessa felt an unsettling sense of determination settle within her. The night hadn't ended as she'd expected, but in many ways it had set her on a new path, one where the fight for justice was no longer just about cases and clients. It was about making real change. Inside the hotel, Vanessa went straight to her laptop. There was work to be done, but this time, it wasn't about a courtroom or a brief. This was about systemic change. She pulled up the police department's records and began searching. The data, the complaints, everything was right there in black and white. Racial profiling was rampant, and it wasn't just Officer Ellis. It was the entire precinct. She could see the reports, the patterns that were far too consistent to ignore. Vanessa's hands hovered over the keyboard as the weight of the evidence settled in. This wasn't about one officer or one mistake. It was about a broken system, and it was time for that system to face the consequences. By morning, Vanessa was sitting across from Governor Mitchell in his office, her laptop open and ready. She had spent hours compiling the evidence, the complaints, the reports, the patterns of bias that had run unchecked for years. The governor was reading through the data now, his face hardening as he saw the depth of the issue. This is bad, he muttered, rubbing his temples. It's worse than bad, James. It's systemic, Vanessa corrected, her voice steady but intense. The entire department has been turning a blind eye to racial profiling for years. This isn't just one officer's failure. It's a culture, a system designed to protect itself, no matter the cost. The governor leaned back in his chair, clearly troubled. I knew there were issues, but I didn't realize it was this deep. What do we do now? Vanessa took a breath. We start by holding people accountable. Ellis needs to be suspended immediately while an independent review board investigates his actions. But that's just the beginning. We need to address the larger issue. We need anti-bias training for every officer, from the top down, and we need an independent body to audit every stop made by the department over the past 3 years. We can't afford to let this go. The governor didn't hesitate. I'll make the call. We'll need full transparency, a press release, and a full investigation. This can't be swept under the rug, not this time. Vanessa nodded, though she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There will be pushback. The union will fight it. Some of the higher-ups will claim it's unnecessary. But if we don't take action now, this will continue to happen. And next time, it might not end so cleanly. He exhaled sharply, his expression serious. I know, but you're right. We have to do something. We'll get the ball rolling today. As the conversation wound down, Vanessa felt a strange sense of resolve settle over her. The governor was on board. The steps to make real change were being set into motion. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Later that afternoon, Officer Ellis sat in the break room of the precinct, his eyes glazed as he scrolled through his phone. The events of the night before played over and over in his mind, and he couldn't escape the sense that everything had unraveled so quickly. The other officers barely looked at him, some giving him nervous glances, others openly avoiding him. Then the captain stepped in. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Ellis, his voice low but filled with authority. Ellis, my office. Now! Ellis's stomach dropped. The tension was palpable as he followed the captain to his office, unsure of what was coming next. The captain didn't waste time. Do you have any idea what kind of mess you've made? Ellis swallowed hard, his voice tight. Sir, I didn't mean to. The captain cut him off. The governor himself called this morning. We're launching an independent review of every stop you've made over the last 3 years. And guess whose name is coming up over and over again? Ellis's face flushed as he realized the gravity of the situation. Suspended, the captain said flatly. Effective immediately. Ellis's world seemed to crash down around him. He opened his mouth to protest, but the captain's cold stare silenced him. This isn't about you doing your job, Ellis. This is about you crossing a line. You don't treat people like that, not without cause. The words stung, and Ellis felt the weight of his actions. He had been wrong. His pride had clouded his judgment, and now he was paying the price. Meanwhile, across town, Vanessa sat in a quiet coffee shop, staring out the window as the city moved around her. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from an unknown number. She opened it, and the words on the screen hit her with unexpected force. "I heard about the review board. Maybe this will make a difference. Maybe it will matter." Vanessa stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, her fingers steady. "I hope so. It has to." She set her phone down and took a slow sip of her coffee. The battle for justice was far from over, but it was a fight she was ready to continue. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. This was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, about making sure this moment didn't fade away like so many before it. Change was slow. It was messy, but it was happening, and Vanessa Harris was going to make sure it didn't stop until it was done.